Apparently, I've convinced 1,000 people to subscribe to this channel. To celebrate, I will be continuing a video I made 4 years ago. Evolution of a Kid Programmer. If you haven't seen it already, you can do so right here. But the synopsis is that I started with Blender's game engine, then moved up to Unity and beyond by making my very own game engine in Java first, then C++. I also mentioned at the end that I had a big old plan with Katsuro, but me and Katsuro have a plan for next year. It's fair to say that nothing really bloomed since that promise I made 5 years ago. I feel like I've completely changed as a person. It's absolutely insane to think that I even thought some of the things I did back then. And you'll see by the end of this video why it's okay to be wrong as long as we change, and to know what's most important from our failures. So, as aforementioned, I made my own game engine in C++ using SDL, OpenGL, and all the good stuff. This game engine was majorly based off of the Binny Box's game engine series. I found myself quite often reprogramming everything from scratch, trying to make something unique of my own creation, but alas, I kept copying Benny. Sure, it was a little different, I definitely added my own flair, but I feel as if I only understood half of what I was doing. Not as in terms of programming, but in terms of logic and design. Eventually, I did get the hang of things, mostly through personal projects and games created using my engine. I embedded Lua Scripting to my game engine. This being my first time doing anything of the sort, it wasn't the best implementation, but it did get the job done. From there, the fan game itself was entirely programmed using Lua. This caused me a few issues, but nothing could have saved my absolutely terrible code. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You see, I needed a new project to really test out my skills and perhaps make a name for myself. And so commenced a 3-year time investment to create a fan game using my very own game engine. What a frickin' adventure that was! I made a whole video talking about that over here. But the synopsis is that I created a game engine and it took so long and it reprogrammed so much that by the end I wasn't even using the same programming language or even the same operating system. It's during this endeavor that a lot of big life changes started happening to me. Since about the start of 2017, I was dual booting Windows and GNU Linux. I started spending more and more time on the latter, but kept the former for, among other things, cross-compiling reasons. It was such a pain to constantly go between Windows and Linux to make sure everything was still compiling and working as intended. Not to mention the move from Visual Studio to the GNU's compiler collection. That made things infinitely more simple on Linux and infinitely more complex on Windows. Development was eventually slowed down by my horrible spaghetti code. Thankfully, after enough complaining, my mom got me a book for Christmas, Clean Code. This book enlightened me to new ideas I've never had before. It was quite refreshing. These new thoughts brought me to research more things, and mixed with my newfound love of Linux, I quickly learned of the Unix philosophy and the simplicity found in the C programming language. This wouldn't be my first time attempting to learn C, but last time I barely got Hello World to display. It was a lot. But this time I was determined, taking things one step at a time. Learning C allowed me to better understand the fundamentals of computer science, something that was somewhat lost in translation with C++. C makes it easy to shoot yourself in the foot. C++ makes it harder, but when you do, it blows your whole leg off. This would be my nth engine and not the last, but for the first time, I actually felt like I knew what I was doing. I no longer relied on tutorials and was actually building my own piece of software in C without many issues. I've been using makefiles for a while and found them quite fun, though I'm not much of a pro. So I created a general purpose C makefile, which is available on my GitLab. It's around this point where I made a very important discovery. Mingu, the software that provides a GCC toolchain on Windows, was actually available on Linux. This meant that I could compile Windows applications on Linux directly. It makes sense when you think about it. It seemed impossible that you could only compile for the platform you were running on directly. But that's absurd. I knew that wasn't how, consoles worked. This truly was a revelation. And nevertheless, with a swift adjustment to my makefile, I now had my very first all-in-one cross-platform project that never required me to leave Linux, other than for testing purposes. And even then, I guess I could use Wine, but that might not be the best for testing. I mentioned earlier a fan game I spent 3 years working on. Well, by this point, that game was ported over to the C game engine. Port, more like rewritten from scratch. And near the end of this project is when I learned to actually test things more often. I wasn't yet done reading the clean code book. My engine was full of problems right and left that Linux was somehow able to save me from, but when it came to the Windows build, the project kept crashing. Oh, how I wish I tested more. How I wish I tested at all. Halfway through development, and during my time rewriting everything in C, I became aware of a classy little scripting language known as Wren, a small, fast, class-based concurrent scripting language. Whenever I need scripting in a project, I am hands down always going to use Wren. Embedding has never been this seamless in any other one of my projects. Not to mention that the syntax is quite familiar and the language interprets quite fast. Lua has some competition. Anyway, this time I chose a different route as the one I took with Lua last time. Instead of embedding the scripting language into the engine, I embedded it into the game itself. Moreover, instead of exposing every single function of the engine, I only exposed certain game-critical functions. Basically, I created the base game using C, and all of the game's actions using Wren. Actions such as opening a door or playing a minigame. All the minigames are created using Wren. This was a much better way of doing things, though my implementation was not perfect. Another great idea was implementing tiled support via Bailey's TMX library. Tiled is a 2D map editor and was used to create all the various scenes found in the game. It's a pretty cool editor all around, and it definitely saved me a ton of time. I've even used it in some other projects too. Though, like most things in this project, the implementation was half-assed. Funny story, at some point the game had real-time lining effects Yeah. They looked pretty sick, and we used normal maps on the sprites to really sell the effect. Lights worked perfectly when I hard-coded everything into place, but when it was loaded from the tiled editor, the color values was all wrong. For the first time, it wasn't my fault. It was an error in the TMX library itself. So I forked the project on GitHub, fixed the problem by adding one single character, and created a well-written pull request that successfully got pulled, making TMX my very first contribution to free and open source software. Hooray! After 3 years of constant stress and problems, I was ready to move on to something else, something easier. Don't worry, I won't be leaving C. I'll keep it for some smaller, more controlled projects. I mean, it's become my absolute favorite programming language. But I do want to work on some bigger projects without having to worry about every single thing. Can you believe that a bunch of people have already made game engines 1,000 times better than mine? One of which is free and open source and called Godot. In many ways, this engine reminds me of GNU and Linux in both its philosophy and execution. The Godot team believes in doing things right and stably before fast and efficiently. Perhaps they're a little more like OpenBSD. Nevertheless, moreover, they have this unique node system to organize game scenes and assets. I find it to be quite ingenious. It reminds me of the first time I saw the Unix file structure coming from Windows. It's different and it's better. Did I mention it was open source? Because it's open source. As of now, I have only made one game with it. This game took me a mere week to create, atop being my first time. Quite a feat, not to me, but the engine itself, I do believe. I barely experimented with it. I was so busy finishing my Televoid fan game, and I still made something good. Godot is what I'll be developing games with for the foreseeable future. It fits all of my current needs. Editor runs on Linux, offers 2D and 3D, which is only getting better, by the way. It's open source, has zero license, well, it has the MIT license, but no licensing. My games belong to me, the engine belongs to me, and it respects me. If you enjoyed this video, you can show your support by liking and subscribing. It's free and fills me with glee. What has your programming journey been like? I'm curious. Let me know in the comments below. If you'd like to learn more about the development of the Televoid fan game, you can check out this video over on User Games, or follow the playlists over here. Thank you for watching.